Bonjour, hello. So, so it will be an uncanny experience because I will speak in English for Team Ingold, English with a French accent, with thanks to the translator, the translation in French and Netherlands. So thank you very much for this word and this invitation. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to introduce you to Tim Ingold because I think he's one of the best anthropologists in the world and has produced so many main contributions to the field of anthropology that it is really a great honor and a great opportunity for us to engage a discussion with him and also to discover more of his work, which has been translated in French. So I will start with a kind of bio-bibliography. Usually, bio-bibliography is a boring moment when we are asked to send some elements of our life to a museum, for a conference, for a journal. But I think in the case of Tim Ingold, the bio-bibliography, that will be life in books, makes sense. Because all the books published by Tim are totally immersed in a singular experience, in a very corporal experience with the world. And I think it is something which is not so common among academics. It is an experience of an ethnologist, an experience of participant observation among population of Laponie. It is also an experience of biologists, because Tim studied first biology at Cambridge, and through his knowledge of biology, he is also able to recognize in a landscape or in an environment different paths, different connections between human and non-human living being. He has also an experience of aesthete or poet. If we keep from the word poiesis, the fact that the poiesis is a capacity to build, the capacity to build some objects, but also to create some performance. And I think this experience is also at the core of his reflection on the way humans are building environment and also how they are making objects. It is last an experience of an educator. He has supervised more than 60 PhD students in all his career. He has been teaching in Helsinki, in Manchester, in Aberdeen, and through all these activities and also with the paper he has published, with all the conferences he gave, this educative process is something that it is also at the core of his work. And also I should say that even if it is a very empirical and experimental experience with the world, which is at the core of his books, he is also a philosopher, and it is the reason why he was invited by Cité Philo. He is not a philosopher by training, but he is a philosopher in the sense that through the discussion with experience, he tries to elaborate new concepts, new vision of the world, and in that sense, I think he is working in a way that it is totally articulated with philosophy. So it is this very singular and prolific experience that is at the core of his bibliography. And the fact that there is this plurality of inspiration in your work explain also why your book are not only important for anthropologists or for academic for the academy. They are also read by artists, architects, specialists of literature, and there is a kind of multiplicity of way to read this work. I will just say a word about the fact that so you've been published 100.5 articles and giving lectures. In English, we've published more than dozens of books. And I think there is like some very famous English philosophers, I think in particular to David Hume. Often the article you publish take the form of an essay. There is one case study. There is an attempt to develop an idea on a case study, on an observation, and it is just an essay. And very often, the book are a set of different essays, are a way to put together different ideas. You don't have a systemic or systematic endeavor in your work, but it is a reason why it is a very lively production, because there is often a first presentation of your ideas in front of an audience. A second version will be an article. A third one will be the integration of the article in a book. And the last one will be the integration of one book or one article in a translation. And when I was thinking about this activity of recombination, of articulation, of the way you produce a lot of texts and books and articles, I was thinking of to one image, which was the image of what is happening when you throw one stone or one pebble in a river or in a lake. It will produce ripples. And the ripple is going to make some movement, and sometime it will touch the other part of the lake. And in my view, your work is a kind of very active productivity, which consists of sending a lot of pebbles in a lake, and they produce a lot of activities in this lake, and they touch in other borders a lot of people who don't have the same questions you are asking at the beginning. And it is something that I want to highlight. I will not try to give a summary of your work, because I think one particular dimension of this work is the fact that a lot of people will get something in what you write. A lot of people from outside the anthropological field will find new answer to their questions, or even they will find new questions they were not able to ask before the reading of your text. So it is really a lively work or lively bibliography, in the sense that the books are producing constant effect of re-elaboration in different fields. In France, you may know that this activity was also at the core of a very abundant process of translation. I will give you a few titles, and also the name of the publishers. Give you an idea also of the fact that this prolix activity is also is also present in the proliferation of publication in France. So the first two books which were published in France were Une brève histoire des lignes et Marcher avec les dragons, published thanks to Zone Sensible publisher, which was very important for the introduction of your work in France. Then, en 2014, Être au monde, quelle expérience commune. It was a discussion with Descola, which took place in 2013. Then books that are more related with not only anthropology but also a school of arts, with one book which is Le Dédale et le labyrinthe, La marche et l'éducation de l'attention, which was published par l'École supérieure d'art et de l'agglomération d'Annecy. One book on which title in French is Faire, anthropologie, archéologie, art et architecture, édition dehors. Et aussi mentionnons l'anthropologie comme éducation aux presses universitaires de Rennes. It's a discussion on the way to articulate anthropology with education. So I think even the plurality of the publishers is a good sign, a good manifestation of the fact that we are in front of an ongoing process, not just of writing or not just of elaboration by team, but also it's an ongoing process of how this productive work is reaching different audience. Before giving you the floor, I will just mention two of the themes of the topics that are very important for me and also for the topic of ecology. So the first one is one of your main contribution to the field of anthropology and to the understanding of ecology. It is a contribution on the topic of ecology of life. And since your first work, you explain very aptly how the interpretation of the environment should take into account two dimensions of human life. Both the action we will have in an environment. And that means, for instance, your first fieldwork in Laponie are showing that the interpretation of the environment is totally linked to hunting activities that are opening different ways to interpret the environment. And this focus on action and skills is also related with the importance of perception that you explain in your books. The fact that to understand how we live in the world or in an environment is this articulation between actions we are exerting on the environment, but also the plurality of perceptions we will have of this environment. This sentient ecology sentient, is highly articulated with another very important topic of your research, is the fact that through your ethnography and also your reading, you contribute to a better understanding of what is animism. What is animism? It's a very strange way to think and also to interact with the world, which involve a kind of distribution of vitality to different beings. So anthropologists, and Tim Ingold has shown in very aptly, anthropologists discover that in the world there are very different ways to consider that life is distributed. And animist societies are societies in which life can be attributed, or vitality can be attributed to beings that are not alive according to the natural science. So that's one of the main contributions on the topic of ecology of life, which involves also very strong claim on the fact that in your book you explain how it is not possible to establish a dualism between organism and environment. And using your background in biology, you also explain in many of your books and papers that an accurate description of the fact of being in the world or to live in the world implies to overcome the dualism between organism and environment and to think how we are totally integrated with the environment and how the environment is totally articulated with us. And together with this very complicated theory of ecology, you have also contributed very to a new way to interpret or to describe technical gesture. For a long time, it was quite obvious that material activity was human action on material, inert material. And you explain in several books that when you describe carefully the activity of an artist or an artisan, you will discover that there is more an interaction between what is in the body of the human, but also how the materiality could be alive in a certain way. So it is this entanglement between living processes in the body and in the object that you describe through a very beautiful way to overcome the dualism between organism and artifact through the notion of growing and making. And you explain in several books that it seems very easy to distinguish between growing and making, and to distinguish between an artifact or an organism. But when you observe it carefully, you can also compare these two activities, because somehow when you grow a plant, you can also that you are giving it, shaping it, you are giving it some forms. And likewise, when you are making an object with material, you are also using a kind of vitality of this material. And so that's why with these two main reflection on technique and ecology, that you have produced a very ambitious system to explain or to explore how we live in the world. And the topic of the conference today is Habiter le monde. And so today you will enter with, you will tackle this issue of habiter le monde, not just through the ecological dimension of our activities, not just through the technical dimension of our practices, but trying to also address a new issue, which is a political issue in a world where it is quite common to say, or in science, at least social science, it is quite common to say that we should create new connection with non-human. We should respect non-human. Sometimes it's a little bit puzzling to discover that there is no room for an elaboration of what could be humanism. And precisely, I think today it's what you want to talk about.
Yes, thank you very much, Patrick, for that very generous introduction. And as you said, I really prefer talking about things that are on my mind at the moment and that I'm thinking about and wrestling with than simply repeating things that I've talked about quite a lot already. And at the moment, I think probably like everybody else, I'm wrestling with the state of the world we find ourselves in just now. It's a very perilous moment, trying to think how I should work through it, respond to it, and also how my own discipline of anthropology should respond to it, and how scholars generally should respond to it. And the way I've been doing this is to think about what could be a new kind of humanism. I mean, 300 years or so ago, philosophers in Europe instigated a program for universal human improvement that came to be known as the Enlightenment. And this was based on a newfound confidence at the time in the power of reason to liberate humanity from the constraints of nature that held all other creatures captive, and to deliver humans to the heights of civilization. So it was based on an idea that there was indeed something special about humans, reason, and that by cultivating reason we could emancipate humanity from the bonds of nature and instigate a real civilization. And this idea spread around the globe through trade and colonization and has underpinned enormous developments in education, in governance, in science, technology, and medicine. And there is absolutely no doubt that it has transformed the lives of millions of people. There is no doubt about the contribution of Enlightenment humanism to the common good. People are living longer than they ever did before, probably more comfortably than they did before. They're enjoying the benefits of science and literature and democratic governance in ways that they never had before. So there's no doubt that the Enlightenment has brought much benefit to humans around the globe. But this has come at a cost. It's come at a cost in two respects. Firstly, the whole idea of the Enlightenment was based on the separation of humanity from nature, the idea that nature is there for humans to dominate, to control, to use to their benefit. And that has driven a process of extraction on an industrial scale, which today has ravaged the Earth's capacity for renewal. And secondly, the appeal to universal human entitlement is one that has always worked in favor of the victors in processes of colonization, not in favor of the victims. And we now know that in some ways the humanism of the Enlightenment provided a kind of ideological cover for a process of colonization, again on a massive scale, that has led to impoverishment, to people's displacement from their land, in some cases even genocide. And as these costs have mounted, we now find that what humanism has left in its wake is a mounting spiral of environmental destruction and social injustice. It seems as though 300 years of progress, far from delivering us to the promised uplands of civilization, leaves us looking into an abyss. So what do we do? At the moment, humanism is having a rough time. It's come under sustained attack politically from both the right and the left of the political spectrum. We know this very well from recent events in America, that for many, humanism comes under attack as being a strategy run by a meritocratic and cosmopolitan elite, that the belief in liberal democracy is simply a way in which metropolitan and cosmopolitan elites have cornered all the benefits of wealth creation for themselves at the expense of ordinary people, that in doing so they've run roughshod over deeply felt attachments to faith, to ancestry, to community, to nation. And as we know, the shameless exploitation of the grievances of the downtrodden by malign actors, who I think in many cases are concerned only with protecting their own ill-begotten wealth and privilege, has or can account for the rise of populisms in many countries around the world. That's from the right. From the left, it's increasingly argued that humanism from the Enlightenment has provided an ideological cover for a process of colonization that's led to enslavement, land appropriation, genocide. And nowadays, huge numbers of people are on the move, trying to find places where they can live, escaping from countries that have been rendered more or less uninhabitable, either due to environmental destruction or to socio-political collapse. And newer pathogens like corporate neoliberalism, algorithmic surveillance are exacerbating the situation, and we see the results in climatic disruption, pandemics, and cyber warfare. So for many of humanism's left-wing critics, there can be no post-colonial future that is not post-humanist as well. But I sometimes think that opponents of humanism should be careful what they wish for. I mean, do we want a world riven by competing fundamentalisms, in which it is the role of everybody to protect their own corner of the world, that's their own patriotic duty to defend their nation against all others? Or do we want a world without literacy, without education, without healthcare and democratic governance, ravaged by preventable disease and ruled by populist demagogues? I mean, these things are happening now, and we seem to lack the resolve to prevent them. And you can't not, you have to ask, I mean, what of the millions of people still denied access to education, medical care, and democratic representations? We can't just turn around and say, sorry, humanism is over now, or into post-humanism now. We have a responsibility to these people. So I think the question for us today, or at least for me, is whether we have the courage to usher in a new settlement which people, maybe another 300 years from now, will see as just as foundational as the Enlightenment of 300 years ago was for us. Well, that is the fundamental question, is what comes after humanism? And I mean by that the humanism of the Enlightenment that has underpinned the last 3 centuries of developments globally. Well, I think there are lots of different visions of what post-humanism might be, but 2 of them stand out for me. One of them takes this divorce of reason from nature to its ultimate conclusion and dreams of a world of virtual reality, artificial intelligence, fully automated work, perhaps a world in which humans will have exited altogether from their mortal bodies and will live immortal, virtual, digital lives. That's one extreme. The other extreme is to argue that in the era of post-humanism, humanity will be left at the mercy of a nature that has gone wild, a feral nature that is running rampant, leaving humans, residual humans, to fend for themselves in a planet run by non-humans. So in the first instance, it looks as though life somehow falls through the gap between outsourced minds and obsolete bodies. In the second, it looks as though humankind has abdicated all responsibility for the ruins of its own creation, as though a kind of post-humanism in which human beings themselves can play no further role in the future flourishing of the planet. And to my mind, neither of these alternatives offers a viable path for generations to come. So I don't think that post-humanism is the answer. What we need is not, I think, a repudiation, a rejection of humanism, but a rejuvenation of humanism. That is to say, we need a new humanism. And here I emphasize new rather than novel. Newness and novelty are quite different. Novelty is about lots of alternative ends, new things we can consume. Newness is about rebirth, about renewal, about bringing a world back into existence. Now, we live at the moment in a world that is obsessed with novelty, with innovation, a world where it's assumed that creativity and innovation mean pretty much the same thing, and that both of them are fundamental to this progress that we all believe in. And in this sort of ideology, the idea is that it is the destiny of every generation to turn its back on generations past and project its new designs on the future. And as generation after generation does the same thing, each generation rejects its predecessors, projects its new designs on the future, then the next generation comes along, rejects those designs, projects its own new designs, and so it goes on over and over again. In the name of progress, each generation's projects are reduced to rubble by the ambitions of the next. Actually, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were onto this as the basic condition of modernity back in 1848 when they wrote the Communist Manifesto, the famous statement, "All that is solid melts into air." They were pointing out that with this constant turnover that is characteristic of bourgeois life, or what we would call modern life, every new design is obsolete before it has even had time to ossify. Obsolescence comes before ossification, and it just carries on like that. Walter Benjamin would go on to take up the same idea in his vision of the angel of history. The angel of history is a figure who has his back turned to progress and is facing the ancestors and would love to bring the ancestors back to life. But the winds of progress are continually beating at his back and depositing piles of rubble at its feet. It's exactly the same image, an accumulating pile of debris. And most of us today find ourselves having to find our way through the ruins, the accumulated ruins of unfulfilled projects left by previous generations. That is how progress works. And I think that post-humanism really offers much of the same, except that many ideas about post-humanism now, they rather than simply turning their back on the previous generation, it wants to turn its back on the whole of human history. So they declare not just that this is they trumpet not just the birth of a new generation, but of a new geological epoch. That epoch is what is now called the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene takes its place amongst three epochs making up the Pleistocene. So there's the Pleistocene. Sorry, the Quaternary period. There's the Pleistocene, the Holocene, and the Anthropocene. So it was melting ice at the end of the Pleistocene that set the stage for history. The Holocene is human history, and now we're coming to the end of history, entering the Anthropocene. So there's a kind of three-stage model: before history, history, after history. So we're now seeing history's final denouement in the advent of the Anthropocene. So in this story of the coming of the Anthropocene, the fate of the planet, for better or for worse, is seen to lie in human hands. I mean, some say that the Anthropocene will usher in a wonderful new age in which the Earth will have been geo-engineered for total human control for perpetuity. Others say that the Anthropocene heralds an era of extinction for humans, if not for all life. And there's no doubt about the reality of the crisis, but what I want to point out is that this is just the latest version of an old story. Theorists of progress, ever since the 19th century, have been arguing that we are on the point of opening the last envelope. There's always this idea that we're nearly there and the great end of all times is just around the corner. So this Anthropocene idea is in some ways just the latest version of an old story. So the question is, for me, where did the old Enlightenment, the Enlightenment of 300 years ago, where did it go wrong? And I think it went wrong at the point when philosophers decreed that rather than following in the footsteps of our ancestors, coexisting with the plants and the animals with which we and our ancestors lived, we should turn to face in the opposite direction. We should turn our backs on the ancestors. Say the ancestors are back there in the past, we're going this way. So the ancestors disappear into the past whilst we head into the future. And this idea of a mighty moment at the start of human history is very deeply embedded in modern myth-making. I learnt it myself when, as a young student of archaeology, I was taught about a character known as Early Man. Early Man was lived maybe a couple of million years ago. He was our most ancient ancestors, and his life was largely comparable to the life of non-human primates. You could compare them with chimpanzees and gorillas and so on. But then there was a mighty moment, as some archaeologists call it the human revolution, a turnaround, where we suddenly see the emergence of what they call people like us. And people like us are called anatomically modern humans. Okay, so they were modern anatomically in the sense that in terms of their physique and their mental capacities, they weren't much different from us, but they were anatomically modern, not culturally modern. And the whole of the civilizational process would then follow from that revolution. And it would be a process that would take them in the opposite direction. Early man would disappear back into the past, but anatomically modern humans were forging ahead, powered by reason, into the future. And therein, according to this myth of modernity, lay the promise of the future. And that had an effect on the way in which modern people, in the wake of the Enlightenment, thought of these key terms of much concern to anthropologists: nature and culture. The idea was that both nature and culture were somehow consigned or relegated to a bygone ancestral past, something to be preserved, something to be recorded, something to be archived, rather than thinking of nature and culture as wellsprings of renewal. So nature and culture acquired their modern meanings at that point when we turned our backs on ancestral ways, whether human or non-human, and began to forge ahead in the opposite direction. However, it is a mistake to suppose, as many of my anthropological colleagues do, and I have to confess that I did not long ago, nature and culture are not new concepts. They're not concepts of modernity. These are words that have been around for at least 2,000 years. And nature, the word nature, comes from the Latin nascere, meaning to be born, and refers basically to a kind of power or life force, a force distributed throughout the cosmos to give birth to new life. It's about the birthing of new life. And the term culture, equally ancient, comes from the Latin collere, meaning to cultivate, and fundamentally it means creating the conditions for this newborn life to flourish. So in that sense, nature renews life, culture helps that newborn life to flourish. Culture follows nature as nurture follows birth. In the life of a baby, nurture follows birth in their every life cycle. But the modern imagination has stripped nature of this power of natality, and it has stripped culture of the task of nourishment or nurture. It's almost as though, if you imagine civilization as a kind of car or a vehicle that is driving away, accelerating forwards, nature and culture are what you see receding behind you in the rear view mirror. So you're shooting out that way, you look in your mirror and you see nature and culture disappearing behind you. And that's what leads us to think of nature as a catalogue of life forms, what we call biodiversity, and culture as a kind of archive of traditions that always seem to be on the point of disappearing. Now, it's true that, as I and many other anthropologists have argued, that there is nothing corresponding to the words nature or culture in their modern inflections in the vocabularies of indigenous people. But that's no reason, I think, to abandon these terms. I would hazard a guess that no people in the world who still draw a living from the lands and waters of this earth, there would be all people who draw a living from the lands and waters of this earth have some idea of a power at large in the cosmos to generate new life. And they all see it as the task of human beings to nurture this life for future generations. So nature gives rise to culture as the labors of birth give way to the work of nourishment. So in that sense, in that original sense, the concepts of nature and culture are fully in tune with indigenous cosmologies and point towards an alternative settlement that I think gives hope for times to come. And this means reversing the turn of the Enlightenment. It means retracing, once again, ways that we once put behind us, once again to cast our lot with those who went before, facing in the same way as them, and seeking a path into the future that we can take together. The key point here is how we think about the future. And so often we think about the future as a problem to be solved. And nowadays we think that we should bring science and technology in to try and solve this problem, whatever it is. But if we think of the future as following in the footsteps of our ancestors, then the future is not a problem to be solved, it is a life to be lived. And finding our way into the future is about relearning the arts of coexistence. And this means exchanging the time of chronological and generational succession with the duration of life itself as it ceaselessly begets new forms. So what I'm calling a new humanism would be committed not to progress, but to the continuity of life. And the path to the future then lies in retracing old ways. But just as we've recovered the old meanings of nature and culture to find a way ahead, the same actually goes, I think, for the concept of the human. It's another very interesting, along with nature and culture, human is a very interesting word. For the philosophers of the old Enlightenment, humanity meant a capacity to break through the barriers of nature. And that idea of humanity as transcending nature was indeed a modern invention. But the concept of the human, just like the words nature and culture, human too is a very old word. In fact, nobody knows quite where it comes from. The philosopher Giambattista Vico, in his New Science of, 1735, speculated that the word human might come from the Latin for soil, humus, and from the word for burial, humando. And he figured that this showed that originally human meant creatures who bury their dead. In which case we could say that humans are creatures of the soil reborn. Or perhaps, many scholars think that Vico's etymology is fanciful, but it's an interesting idea to think about human as an endless capacity for rebirth. Back in the 13th century, the Catalan mystic Ramon Llull, in his book called New Logic, said, Homo est animal homificans. The human is a humanifying animal. And he meant by humanifying an animal that continually creates itself in the crucible of a life lived together with others. It's an animal that is continually creating. It's not as though humanity is any sense given. Humanifying means you're continually working at it. And I began to think maybe the solution is to treat human as a verb. Let's have a verb, to human. And what we do is humaning. And humaning is a collective task. It's the task of leading life rather than living it, or what Aristotle would call bios rather than zoe. The ceaseless work of recreating ourselves, one another, and the world around us in the milieu of our common existence. So where humanity in the Enlightenment model is transcendent, humaning is immanent. It's immanent in the power of nature to bring forth life, and in the work of culture in its nourishment and care. And that is what makes it exceptional. Now, there are two objections that are commonly raised against the old humanism, the humanism of the Enlightenment. One is that it was anthropocentric, and the other is that it was Eurocentric. And I think neither criticism really quite works. On the question of anthropocentrism, actually what Enlightenment humanism did was to decenter the human, to put the human at the top of a pinnacle, of a pyramid, with the rest of nature at its feet. So basically, in its appeal to reason, Enlightenment humanism took humans out of the center of the world and put them on the top of a pinnacle. So it was a decentering movement, which, and in their appeal to universal reason, this humanism of the Enlightenment actually repudiated any affiliation to place, region, or continent. I mean, reason is everywhere. So that it's true that philosophers of the time argued that reason was developed to different degrees in different nations, and they assumed that it was most developed in Europe. So they were, of course, ethnocentric in their way, but that bias, that Eurocentric bias, was not intrinsic to their philosophy. It wasn't intrinsic to their philosophy as it was, for example, for the latter-day followers of Darwin, who argued that improvements in mental capacity were directly related to hereditary mental endowments. That was a raciology, and Enlightenment humanism was not racist in that sense. So I would want to argue that actually both anthropocentrism and regional affiliation are fundamental to a new humanism. Humans really are exceptional. Now, I know this is an extremely controversial thing to say, and I had to really pull myself to say it. Even my good colleague and sparring partner in many a debate, Philippe Descola, who was with you last year, I think, the recent publication has on the front, human exceptionalism is a dangerous illusion, Philippe Descola. So I want to say, actually, human exceptionalism is not dangerous, it is not an illusion, but we have to be careful about what we mean by it. Because what is the illusion, I think, is the assumption that exceptionalism implies superiority. That somehow, for humans to be exceptional, it means humans are up on top with the rest of the world down below. So that's where the illusion is. For the new humanism that I'm advocating, humans are exceptional not because of any will to control, a will to dominate, but because of love. They are exceptional in their love for the world. This is what the philosopher Hannah Arendt called amor mundi, love for the world. And in her argument, we have to regain our love for the world, otherwise there's no hope for times to come. And I agree. And this is a love born of a reverence for the creative power of nature and enacted in the work of culture. And the thing is that this love puts upon our shoulders, our human shoulders, a burden of responsibility that is not shared by other beings. It's a responsibility to sustain the balance of nature and to ensure its fecundity for generations to come. And it's a burden, a responsibility that we can only exercise from the beating heart of the world itself. We have to be right there in the middle of it all. So new humanism actually aims to recenter the human, from which emplaced center we can foster relations of care with the earth and its inhabitants. So this is anthropocentric in the benign sense of the term. Only from a position at the center of the life world can we exercise our proper responsibilities of care towards it. But the question remains, why humans? Why is it that humans have this responsibility of care and not other creatures? And there again, I think I want to say something which is a little unfashionable now, but I think it's because of language. But I don't mean language as the philosophers of the old Enlightenment thought of it, that is, as the executive arm of reason. A language, the language of reason, can be spoken by anybody. So it's a universal language. But in the new humanism, language is manifested as a kind of polyphony of voices, a kind of chorus, each of which is brought forth in the solicitation of voices of others, and each issuing from somewhere in the world, resonating to the depths of the region to which it belongs and to its relations with co-inhabitants. And that's why attachments to place and region are so fundamental. And remember that not only humans have voices, I mean, non-human phenomena can have voices too. The whispering trees, the babbling brook, the roaring thunder, the cracking glacier. And when we listen to these sounds, as we call them, the sounds of nature, listening, hearing, it's not possessing nature, it's being possessed. It's not possessing the trees, the brook, the thunder, the glacier, it is being possessed by them. So by lending our ears, that is our oral attention to non-human phenomena, these phenomena are given a voice and can join the chorus. But it's a chorus that only we humans can hear. I think magic, shamanism, spirit possession are all forms which anthropologists have spoken about a lot, ways in which humans do not possess but are possessed by the world and exercise their responsibility through that. So, and since only humans can hear the chorus, then they alone can respond. And that's why I think they carry a burden of responsibility that other creatures don't. So, from that perspective, language is not an instrument of reason, it is an instrument of responsibility. And it's played not from on top of the world, but from within its midst. Okay, so I want to pick up now from the narrative that I left off a moment ago with the human just on its way to, supposedly, the new era of the post-humanism, the post-human era of the Anthropocene. If somebody came along to you and said, do you know, you are on the point of entering a new post-human, post-historic era, what sense would it make to you? You can imagine asking the same question of our Paleolithic ancestors back in deep prehistory. Suppose we had a time machine and we could go back to Paleolithic times, and we were speaking to a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer in the Ice Age and said, "Did you know you're living in prehistory?" Would that make any sense at all to those people of that time? Of course not. They're simply carrying on with their lives. And it's not really possible for them or anybody else to distinguish the events of their lives just carrying on and the events that might actually give rise to something called history. And it's the same thing for us now. How on earth are we supposed to distinguish between the events of history and the events that are supposed to bring history to an end? It's not in practical practice possible to distinguish these things. So, if we can't distinguish them, then we could ask, what could people in 300 years' time make of us? I mean, imagine perhaps back in the time of the Enlightenment, 300 years ago, maybe those guys, those philosophers were saying, I wonder what people will be like in 300 years' time. Those people in 300 years' time, they're us. Now let's suppose there's some people 300 years from now, and they're looking back and saying, I wonder, what did we do? But we could turn the question around and say, let's wonder, what will life be like for people living 300 years from now? Can we say anything about them? Well, it might be difficult, but I think there are three definite things we can say about people living, assuming we've got some descendants 300 years from now. There are three definite things we can say about them. First, that those people will still have to eat, which means they'll have to labor on the earth, under the sky. And because of the even now today, the majority of the world's inhabitants live in cities, so probably they'll be living in cities too, and these cities will be centers of food production, because the systems which send food halfway around the world between producers and consumers will have broken down long ago. They're unsustainable. So people will be growing their own food in cities. The disciplines of agriculture and urban planning and architecture will have merged together into one. So that's one thing we can say about them. And maybe we can find models for this kind of urban dwelling from ancient cities long sidelined by Western histories in places like Mesoamerica and East and Southeast Asia. Second thing is that these humans in 300 years' time, they'll still have the organs of sense, eyes, ears, nose, and so on. They'll have lips and vocal cords, they'll have fingers and toes, and they'll be able to look and feel and respond to environmental variations, just as we do. They'll be able to work with their hands, walk on 2 feet, communicate with speech and gesture. There will be social beings with lives rooted in the places they inhabit and the lands they know. That's the second thing. The third thing we can be absolutely certain about is that the digital technology that we now consider indispensable for our lives will have long since imploded, including the internet, telecommunications, artificial intelligence, and robotics, because they placed demands on the environment that were simply unsustainable. Think of the many people enslaved at the moment in sometimes appalling conditions, extracting the toxic heavy metals upon which our digital devices depend. Think about the expenditure of energy in keeping those immense supercomputers going, which has to be multiplied several hundred times in order to support the kind of artificial intelligence that our technocrats are dreaming about. Think of the energy taken to blast all those rockets into space to launch the communication satellites that are needed. There's no way in which this can carry on. I don't know when it will end or how it will end, but I'm inclined to, it's a bit like saying, I know I'm going to die, I don't know how or when, but it's going to happen. And the same will definitely happen to digital technology. I tend to apply a 150-year rule. I mean, that coal lasted roughly from 1810 to 1960. oil and gas roughly from 1910 to say 2060. So if we apply that rule, digital technology, if we start from about 1980, has until 2130. I wouldn't give it longer than that. So in 300 years' time, our descendants will depend on the bodily skills they have to eke out a livelihood at high concentrations on an earth and under heavens which have become junkyards of defunct devices. But the silly thing is that with our story of the Anthropocene, we turn this scenario back to front. We somehow imagine that it's the bodily organs of action and perception that are destined for extinction, while digital technology will somehow be magically self-sustaining. So we dream of a digital future that is post-human, when really what we can be sure of is a human future that is post-digital. And the new humanism is looking towards a human future that is post-digital, not a digital future that is post-human. And I think maybe I should stop there, because otherwise I'll go on for too long.
Because if we want some questions...
Yes, sorry, I lost the time.
No, but it was fascinating. So thank you very much. It was very... I didn't want to interrupt, but maybe you can give us from other point later in the discussion. So I will just make some comments, and then we can open to the audience. You can prepare your questions, short questions, because I need to translate them to Tim. Well, I really enjoy this very new paper, indeed, because it created a kind of new approach on nature culture, because we, for maybe 30 or 40 years, for now it has become maybe a kind of new mantra that we should overcome nature culture. And sometimes students, they start their presentation saying, yeah, I want to overcome the dualism between nature and culture. So it's kind of the way we think, and but repetitively there is also this, if it was a success to overcome this dualism, we would have known it. So somehow the fact that we are not able to totally overcome this dualism is something that you try to deal with. And I really enjoyed your solution, which is to say that somehow what is at stake is the fact that life is a power. And this power is not a power that the human can control by themselves. They need to articulate with a kind of... I know that you don't like the notion of agency, but they have to articulate with non-human power the fact that we make the experience of growing, of procreation, reproduction in our body and also in nature, in animals, in plants, but we are not able to exert that power by ourselves. So I really like the fact that you, instead of establishing a discontinuity between nature and culture, you explore a very new way to create a continuity, and I think it's something that will be discussed by the anthropology community. So I really like this, and I also want to highlight that your elaboration on temporality is something very new, if I may say, and because there is a kind of very mechanical way to make history sometimes. Anthropocene for me is it has become a very automatic way to organize temporality, as you said. I like the distinction between new and novelty, and also it changed a little bit from the Latourian, Bruno Latour perspective, exposed in a book which title is Nous n'avons jamais été modernes. So I would be very interested to really have a further exploration the link between newness and modernity. I think you've already said something, but maybe there is some element we can have. And I will make a first question about this idea of coexistence, because I like also the epistemological movement saying that we should put human at the center, but not in a position of supremacy. I think it's something that I will totally follow. It is also a position that, for me at least, is totally echoing the position of Lévi-Strauss in a discourse 20 years ago when he received the Catalonia Prize. He was saying that humans have destroyed non-human life, and it's time now to create a new humanism somehow. I don't know if the word appears like this, but he contends that we should invent new law or new rights for living beings on the earth, including human. So my first question would be, somehow I would ask, if we are all in the same world, where are the rules? Who is ruling this world? Because somehow, if we follow, we are dependent on the power of life, detained by nature. But if we are in a situation of coexistence, human societies, they need rules, they need status, they need hierarchy maybe. So I wonder how you can translate this very positive and optimistic, and I think it's something that is also quite new to have not a pessimist discourse. But how you articulate this optimistic discourse of coexistence with institution of power, of law, of maybe economics. So that will be a first general question I will ask. But
thank you very much. And I mean, it's not an easy question to answer, but I've been talking a lot. I didn't use the word rules, but I did often use the word responsibility. And I see this as a question of what exactly is the relation between the two. And I would argue that you can't have responsibility without responsiveness. That is, there must be, to exercise responsibility, you must have some capacity to respond. And that capacity to respond depends on an education of powers of attention and care and so on, and we can agree on that. So there can be no responsibility without responsiveness. But can there be responsibility without rules? One thing I'm sure of is that you can't make up for a lack of responsiveness by putting rules there instead. Often we think that by legislating, by creating a rule, we can solve a problem, that people have been doing bad things. We'll create a rule, say they shouldn't do that. And it doesn't work, because if the responsiveness is not there, if people are not paying the attention that would give a kind of moral and ethical force to their responsibility, then instituting a rule won't make any difference. And often, as you know, rules really only come into play when things go wrong. It's a sort of fallback solution if nothing else works. Otherwise, you just carry on your life in a responsive and responsible way without thinking about the rules very much. So many cities, for example, are finding that maybe they can do better without traffic lights. Just leave it to pedestrians and motorists to keep an eye on one another and pay attention to what they're doing. You get less accidents than if you have a rule saying you're not allowed to go through when the light is red, because then people don't pay any attention at all and assume if it's green, I'll just drive straight through. So I would actually question the necessity of a rules-based order, although just politically rather, that what is missing is not we don't have enough rules or adequate rules or a functioning judiciary. What is missing is responsiveness and attention. And we can't, substitute one for the other.
And I will have another question, which is not the question we talked earlier, but which is related again with the notion of life as a power. Because in my last book that Véronique just mentioned, Ce que les humains font avec la vie, one of my main claim is to say that human societies are organized to deal with two phenomena. One is the power of life, the fact that they cannot produce life. They need to interact with entities that Martial Salins used to call meta-person, ancestor, gods, and so on. So the societies deal with this non-human agent through rituality very often. And so another question would be, in your system, is there still room for rituality? Do you need rituality? Or what is the meaning of rituality in a lot of human society? Because somehow rituality is also a way to connect with non-human. And the other point I would like to just mention is human societies are also organized in order to, and I totally follow you on this, they are organized to take care of vulnerability of human life. And somehow you can also, that you were mentioning Hannah Arendt, but it is also the case with Durkheim. Both of them were saying that every society has to create new member of the society with newborn child. And somehow this movement, this continuous movement of taking care of newborn children is something that is present in all the societies. And obviously all the philosophy of care or politics of care, all the philosophy and anthropology, the work on vulnerability are also opening the description of social interactions or political organization, not just as the power to exert power on the other, but also the capacity of the collective to take care and to take care of ourselves, but also to take care of the other. Because I think one of the conclusion of the ethics of care or politics of care is a kind of new universalism. And I think maybe it goes in that direction when you were mentioning a new humanism. It's also a way to imagine that we are all vulnerable, human, but also non-human. And I think it totally has effect on the social organization. It was just a comment, but just I would like to know in your system, although it's not a system, but in your new idea on new humanism, what is the function, or maybe it's just a room for rituality or ritual events?
I think I would go back to Arendt again, where she argues that it's the responsibility of all of us to introduce new people into old ways. The new people, of course, being children, young people, and that we are generating. And we have to introduce them into the world we know. Not into some new world, not into some proposed world, not in some new revolutionary order, but into the familiar world that we know and that was handed on to us by our ancestors in the same way. And I think that what we're calling ritual is, as you know, it's a very difficult and in many ways unsatisfactory word for all sorts of things, but there's an element of faith in it, there's an element of religiosity, there's an element of what I call knowing from the inside, but there's also an element of veneration. And I think when I talk about following in the footsteps of one's ancestors, that is a process of venerating, revering the ancestors. And in that sense, people would say that Arendt's philosophy is deeply conservative. And I would say that in that new humanism, as I've advocated it, shares that conservatism. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's conservatism with a small c, nothing to do with the Conservative Party or things like that. And that is that veneration for, and only if we have that love, that veneration, that reverence for the old ways and the people who represented it, only then is there hope for its renewal for the future. That's the point, that you have to revere the past in order to establish hope for the future. And the contrary to tradition, the situation we're in now, as a great colleague of mine, Norman Würzberg, as theologian, has argued that we have a generation of orphans, people in the sense who have no love for the world, whose parents told them, this world is a brutal place. We don't want to introduce you to it. They have no love for it, but nor do they have the resources to create a new one in its place. And that's the difficulty that we're in at the moment. I want to say that the way forward is not to imagine revolutionary new worlds. It's to rediscover the love for the world we have. It might be full of all sorts of faults. It is. But we need to honor it.
And maybe I will before giving the floor to other persons who want to ask questions, as we are in an art center, I was wondering, because you discuss art objects or projects or performance, and you are also your books are very inspirational for artists. So I was wondering how you would articulate this new humanism with the expressive power of art, or the capacity of art to create a new sensibility or to create new collective. Do you have maybe examples of what kind of performance or artwork that could be relevant for this project you were exposing?
I've been very inspired by the work of the educational philosopher Gert Biester. He has a recent book, 2017, I think, called Letting Art Teach, and it's about education and about art. But he argues that it's not that we need to be taught about art, it's we need to let art teach us. And very much influenced by Arendt, he says that if something is present before us, it could be a work of art, it could be a natural phenomenon of some kind. If something is present before us, there are three possibilities. We could seek to control and dominate it. That would be world-destroying. We could retreat and escape for it. That would be self-destroying. Or we could hold our ground and say, here am I, there is this thing, now I'm going to try and come to terms with it, engage with it, establish a dialogue with it. And out of that, something will come. That's holding to the middle ground. And he argues, and I agree, that middle ground is where we need to be. I want to get beyond the niche that art occupies within the standard Enlightenment model, which is that art is, and the history of art is part of the history of civilization, that art is a complement to science, whereas science gives us objective knowledge about the world, art gives scope for subjective self-expression, for empathy, for feeling, that the two complement one another. And that view of art is still very, very strongly established, especially in our educational institutions. Art as a complement to science, as the subject complements the object, as feeling, empathy complements objective investigation. And I think we really need to get beyond that and stop thinking of art as a means of subjective self-expression, and thinking rather of art as a way of making the world present. to us. And to recognize that then the creativity of art has got nothing to do with the genius of its creator. Art draws its creative impetus from that nascere, that power of the world to give birth to itself, that creative force that is immanent in the world itself, from which we get the word nature. That's where art takes its creativity from. And the job of the artist is to be a poet in the sense of bringing the world into presence so that we can become aware of it and begin to engage with it.
And do you think this experience could be better, has a better chance to appear in the field with, for instance, land art or ecological art? Or you can also have this kind of experience inside a museum with, I don't know, a piece of bioart? Do you think it's the same experience of being alive? Or do you have something you prefer?
Right. I would rather not be inside the museum if I could help it. It may be that we have to, that for practical reasons, and if you want to bring work to people, the museum might be the only way to do it. But if I encounter art in the museum, and well, I don't actually encounter art. Well, I might encounter it first in the museum, but art is only art if it stays with me. So I take it with me out of, I've seen it there in the museum, but I take it with me out of the museum. And out of the museum, the art leads me to see things that I would not have seen otherwise. So the art has an afterlife beyond the museum. And only if it has that afterlife does that art work.
Okay.
For me, anyway.
So I'm sure we will have plenty of comments or questions, so you can ask the question in the language you prefer. We will try to translate it, or we will translate it.
Here.
Ici,
One.
à la gauche, here.
I have the mic.
Oh, you have it.
Five.
Thank you first. It was very, very interesting. It was also very pleasing to hear you saying that, to talk about the possible post-digital human. At the same time, hard to believe. And I was wondering if you wrote already about it and where I can find some development on that, or if you're writing on it at the moment, or if you can elaborate a bit on it now.
Thanks. That gives me the opportunity to say something that I didn't otherwise have time for. And I mean, I'm writing about it now, literally. So, and I'm still thinking about it now. So these ideas are still half formed. But one thing that I tried out as an experiment was to ask people to compare two objects, a laptop computer and a loaf of bread. The laptop computer and the loaf of bread, they weigh about the same volume, a bit different in shape, but never mind. But then you could ask the question, which is likely to last longer, the loaf of bread or the laptop computer? I don't mean that particular loaf of bread, but a loaf of bread generically. And many today would say, oh, the loaf of bread, we're finished with bread. It's you buy your industrial loaves from the supermarket now anyway. We don't grow the crops. We don't know how to bake. We don't know how to knead the dough or anything like that. And anyway, we're looking forward to a time when humans won't need to eat anymore because they'll have become digitized. So they'd say, we'll put our money on the laptop computer, not the loaf of bread. I would say the loaf of bread has been around for around about 8,000 years. The laptop computer has been around for about 40 years at a stretch. I would say that, and And the loaf of bread is pretty much like loaves of bread always were. I mean, the taste might have changed, it might be baked slightly differently, but we wouldn't necessarily say that an artisan loaf today is better or worse than a loaf baked by the ancient Egyptians or Sumerians 8,000 years ago. But the laptop advancing at a bewildering rate. There's generation after generation after generation. One laptop generation is just a few years, and then the next system comes along, the next system comes along, and they're all supposed to be improvements on what we had before. So it looks to me like the laptop marks a history of progress that's destined for extinction within the next decades. If the loaf of bread has been around for 8,000 years, I don't see why it shouldn't be around for another 8,000. And it would probably be a good idea if we decide where to invest, where to place our bets. It'd probably be a good idea to bet on the loaf rather than the laptop. But that's what I'm thinking at the moment.
Yeah, there's one here and one here. Yeah, do not hesitate to indicate before so that we can give you the micro.
Well, Mr. Ingold, thank you very much for this very stimulating presentation, and Mr. Pitrou as well. You set my mind thinking a lot. Thank you for doing that. I would like to know what your take is on this very, very stunning parallel between the shame experienced by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden due to their nakedness, and the shame that we ourselves are increasingly led to feel, the shame that we are not up to this time of super intelligence, the fact that we are being constantly augmented, enhanced. We are using sat-nav navigation. We are using calculation machines, very, very complex technology, which may result in us feeling really, 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 really shameful. And so my question is this. The more intelligent we become collectively through our elites, the more stupid normal citizens like myself are becoming, in fact. So there is no reason why we should not feel more and more miserable with a deeper and deeper complex of inferiority towards technology. By the way, incidentally, we are increasingly being overwhelmed by artificial intelligence. Actually, isn't artificial intelligence, shouldn't it rather be seen as artificial life, actually, instead of artificial intelligence? And so my question is, what do we need in order to be born again, as you were suggesting? What is the prerequisite for a new kind of wisdom before we die from this misery of being so much inferior to technology and the superiority of Superman like Elon Musk and the likes? Thank you.
Well, as we know, there are some very stupid people advocating very highly intelligent machines, and Elon Musk being a case in point. But I think that, I mean, this is a very complicated question, but I think part of the problem that you diagnose and the misery that comes from it is a particular way we in modernity have in thinking about generational replacement and generational progress. If you go back, for example, to Charles Darwin in The Descent of Man, he has a scenario there about human evolution, which he saw as where he saw that the civilized mind exceeds the mind of the savage, as the mind of the savage exceeds that of the ape. And his argument was that natural selection works as a kind of ratchet mechanism which ensures that in each successive generation, those populations that have a greater proportion of more intelligent individuals will win out in competition over those that have a lower proportion. So the logic is that generation replaces generation. One supplants the other. The civilized man supplants the savage supplants the primate. There's this scenario of successive replacement in which the more intelligent always replaces the less intelligent. And if we take that logic, as many contemporary commentators do, if we take that logic to its logical conclusion, we would say that if and when we develop more intelligent forms of technology, life, whatever you call it, if more intelligent forms emerge, then they will replace us as surely as we've replaced those less intelligent than ourselves, according to that evolutionary model. In which case, we feel miserable because we think we've launched these intelligent machines and in doing so only revealed our own inferiority by comparison. I think this model of generational succession and replacement is the source of all our troubles. We should stop thinking about generations in that kind of way and think of generations rather as overlapping longitudinally along their length so that old and young can collaborate in forging a future together. It's not a matter of replacement, it's a matter of collaboration and continuity. So that's part of the question. And the other part is that this idea of intelligence that is being used, particularly in the artificial intelligence discourse, is a highly reductive one and is fundamentally different from what we would call wisdom. Quite different. And what we're short of at the moment is wisdom. And we need more of it. And wisdom is based on attention and care rather than calculation and deduction. So we need wisdom and not intelligence. Or maybe I should just stop there. We need wisdom and not intelligence, and we need to get rid of this idea of successive replacement, in which every generation is simply confirmed in its own inferiority in relation to what is going to supplant it.
I think there is one question, but I've just a small follow-up question on this. I wonder if somehow, what do you think about the idea, if the relation between society and life, and the fact that human societies are able to nurture life or to take care of life in a good way, or less, or sometimes in a good, in not so good way or so good manner. I wonder if there is also a temporality of the society as a kind of living being, because in the text by Lévi-Strauss I was mentioning, he also says that societies are growing, they are surviving, and sometimes there is a decay and they disappear. So what will be your take on this, the comparison between society and organism in a kind of evolutive framework you were just criticizing?
Well, there's a difference between social life and the life of society. And I mean, Durkheim himself said that we should think of societies as living organisms, and he treated the society as a quasi-organic entity which would have an evolution like organisms do. And Levi-Strauss did much the same, Radcliffe Brown, many famous anthropologists have done the same. And I think they've made a fundamental mistake in supposing that where there is social life, there is a life of society. To my mind, what we are calling societies are really conversations. And when we say there's a society here, what we mean is that there's a particular density of conversation. There's some people coming together and they're doing things together. They're collaborating, they're having a conversation, they may be building institutions. We can call that, it's a process that's going on, but I see that as a bundle of lines all tangled up. And the thing about a bundle of lines is it doesn't have an edge. And it just reminds me of one thing that I forgot to answer. You brought up this issue about universalism. And the old humanism was obviously committed to human universals, to human universality. I think the new humanism is, but it's a different meaning of universalism, which is closer to what William James called pluriversalism or multiversalism. It's saying not that we all share the same thing, or that we can write one common history for humanity as a whole. It's rather saying that we are all inhabitants of one world, but the oneness of that world lies in its capacity for endless multiplication and differentiation.
I think there is one question here, another one here. Now there is plenty of questions, so or maybe we could have two or three questions, and you can answer if we want to have different voices precisely. So please.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I felt like in the titles and in the words employed, there was some clear references to maybe Heidegger with the fact of inhabiting the world or being in the world. And I also feel like your point of view goes back to also Heidegger's inhabit with the world. And I thought that what was interesting is in Heidegger's philosophy, we have the idea that technology is a bad thing because of the inauthentic life, but also it feels like a way of revealing nature. And so instead of maybe having a technophobic point of view and being against capitalism, can we not just imagine a way to bring closer the unstoppable and ongoing process of capitalism with a life that can bring us together? For instance, with new technologies, younger people tend to communicate more and more. We have more and more facilities to be able to talk about mental health, global issues. And so, yes, this is my question.
So, yeah, or maybe you should answer now because it was a
big one.
A very interesting question. Thank you very much. So,
well, Heidegger is in there. There are inspirations that I've got from Heidegger, and but at the same time, I want to keep Heidegger at arm's length for rather obvious reasons. There are aspects of Heidegger's philosophy where I wouldn't want to go, and of course he was an impossible. He must have been a horrible man. There are aspects of this technological pessimism. I've also been greatly inspired by the work of André Laroche-Gourand, who was a technological optimist. He saw the technology as really giving birth to wonderful, wonderful things. I myself personally feel that I'm something of a technophobe. I certainly hate digital technology. I really don't like it, and that was probably obvious from what I said. But what you were saying about technology and capitalism made me think of the paradox of Japan, where I visited recently, not for the first time. But the puzzle about Japan is that Japanese people are genuinely reverential towards nature, towards their ancestors, towards craft and skill. They're genuinely reverential, and this is manifested in the things they do and make. And yet, Japan is also an advanced capitalist society with massive global corporations, and that is leading the way in technological innovation. And I've often asked my Japanese colleagues, how is this possible? How can you reconcile these two things? Because to me, to my Western imagination, they are directly opposed. I cannot see how you can wed global corporate capitalism and a reverence for ancestral ways, for craft, for nature, and so on. But somehow in Japan, they can do it. And I would like to find out what the secret is, because I think there's something there that we've not quite adequately grasped. And if we could, it might help us solve the conundrum that you are pointing to.
So someone has a micro? Yeah, please. Here on the right. Oh.
I was very interested in the connection that you made between the question of crisis and the question of love, and especially for your younger generation, and the place that art can take inside this paradox. And when you elaborate on the concept of love and the fact that younger generation don't have so much love about the world, I had the feeling also that it was not so much about the world, but also towards mankind. And in the job that artists have to represent the world on stage, to make it present, sometimes it's very difficult because it's also horrific visions sometimes. So I wanted to ask you about the relation between love and fear for younger generation, and also about the idea that is the crisis, the political and ecological crisis that we are living now, is it just for you one more crisis, or is it a specific crisis that generates a specific response for younger generations?
Can I answer that? It's just also a very, very deep and difficult question. And I think the answer about crisis, I think, is both. That it is one more crisis, and yet this is, I might say it's the mother of all crises. I mean, that it is yet, I mean, that crisis, I think that it shares the same root with, from Greek, we get create, that there's, that crisis doesn't have to be bad. The crisis can mean a place where things come together in such a way as to generate, through sometimes their antagonism, a great creative force. So crisis is a source of sometimes positive as well as negative energy. But at the same time, I think that the crisis that we're in at the moment is qualitatively different from crises that have appeared in the past. So both, yes, it's always crisis, but no, this crisis is of a different order. I think that's what I would say. About love and fear, it seems to me that these are two sides of the same coin. I don't know whether you can have one without the other. And again, I wouldn't want to give unequivocal positive or negative connotations to either term. To say that love is good and fear is bad, for example, or love is positive or fear is negative. Both love and fear are two sides of the same coin, and both are both positive and negative in their ways, in very complicated ways. But what I do feel with the younger generation, and this applies to what we mean by the meaning of contemporary art, that we tend to think of contemporary art as art, the art of the present, chronologically defined. But contemporaneity really means shared time. And I think that you might actually argue that that for art to work as art, it must inspire the same kind of love in those who see it as parents inspire in their children. So I almost think of a kind of lineage with the world, the art, and we who look at the art. If the art is a child of the world, then we're its grandchildren, and together they form a lineage. And that lineage is a lineage of shared time. It's a lineage of contemporaneity. So you could even argue that Australian Aboriginal people, when they decorate their bodies and sing the songs of their ancestors and become their ancestors, that art is contemporary, although it's been something that they've been doing for thousands of years. So the traditional can be contemporary in that sense. What I worry about is the kind of art that is really just a shout or a cry of despair, because that art, like a shout, just evaporates into the environment. It doesn't inspire the kind of love that ensures that continuation of that lineage, which I think is really what art needs to do. One in the front. Oh, you get there in the end.
Can you listen to me? Yes, can you hear me? I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about the problem of our relationship to time?
Yes.
And I changed many things in my life. Now I'm in agriculture, and now I see things totally differently. I'm more rich in time, and for me, time is artificial now. And can you translate, if you can get my idea, about the problem of urbanization? And time is not just a sound or a rhythm, no? I really, for me, many things are killed. No, I forgot my word in English now.
En français.
Allez-y en français.
Wait, no, but I have my idea in English. Can you talk about time and about the economical system? Because I'm quite worried about the power of multinationals, the companies, and the structures are so heavy.
Yes.
So I feel like really powerless. Like many of us probably.
Yeah.
And how to follow your work?
Yeah.
To make petitions.
To make petitions. I think you're talking in agriculture, for example. You're talking about a different kind of time. So it's not just that time has to be there's the kind of time as basically chronological time which is evidenced in constant replacement, as when generations replace generations, or innovation replaces innovation. That's that kind of time. It's a bit like the ratchet mechanism of a clock. You know, when an old-fashioned clock goes tick, 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 it's because there's a ratchet and there's a spring that's been wound up, and as the spring unwinds, there's a succession of backward movements, and all those backward movements, each one of those is a second. And so we think of time as this notching up of backward movements, whereas in life there's a continuous forward movement, actually, a movement of growth. You can't put it backwards. That crops grow, clouds grow. Life is moving onwards in that sense. It's not a succession of backward movements. So it's a different sense of time that was common in back in the days when medieval times, for example, when most people were farming and tied to the agricultural cycle. They would think of time in terms of the rhythmic interlocking of different life cycles, cycles of growth and cropping, and so on. And I think it's really important to try and re-establish that sense of time as duration. At the moment, I'm going to get back to the laptop I mentioned. You open your laptop and it will tell you at the bottom exactly what the time is, and you can have a conversation on Zoom, and you can be together with other people in any other part of the world at exactly the same time, adjusting to different time zones. So that you get this sense of a time as a slice right across the entirety of humanity, instead of the sense of duration. And so we need to, I would think that we need to find a way of re-establishing that sense of duration. I don't quite know how we do it politically, but there was something I just wanted to say. Oh yes, that many people argue that we need to slow down. So the problem is that time is going too fast, and I don't think that's really what it is. It's not fast versus slow, because if you're working on a farm, there are some things you have to do very quickly indeed. The job has to be done, crops have to be harvested before the rains come or whatever. So you have to work hard and fast. It's not to do with the slowness or fastness of time. It's to do with the extent to which tasks are responsive to social and environmental variations. And so it's about timing, or what the Greeks call kairos, getting that moment exactly right, the right moment to undertake a task. And you can only have timing, good timing, if you're paying really good attention to everything that's going on around you. What we're objecting to is a kind of time that, quite to the contrary, tells you what the time is without you having to pay any attention to anything, because it's just there.
We've got one question here in front. Une dernière question. La dernière.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation très stimulante. Alors, moi, je vous ai trouvé un petit peu sévère avec l'humanisme des Lumières. Voilà, dans la mesure où il y a quand même pas mal de figures qui se sont élevées contre l'exploitation des ressources, l'exploitation de l'homme par l'homme, l'esclavage, etc. Et par contre, je ne vous ai pas entendu parler dans votre présentation dans ce nouvel humanisme que vous appelez de vos voeux, je vous ai pas entendu parler de critique d'un système en fait de production, d'un système de consommation aussi, qui a pour conséquence une exploitation des ressources terrestres à outrance, au nom du profit, qui est source d'inégalités sociales, etc. Enfin bon, on connaît tout ça. Et donc je me demande dans quelle mesure est-ce que le nouvel humanisme que vous appelez de vos voeux ne passe-t-il pas nécessairement par la fin de ce système économique capitaliste et de ces nouvelles formes néolibérales. Voilà.
Did you ask the question, or do you
Yeah,
want
can you just...
So, this person says that you were a little bit very critics against humanism, which had the capacity of self-reflexivity and internal criticism. And at the same time, you were not avoiding somehow to address the issue of capitalism, extractivism. Well, you mentioned the word extractivism and system of production, etc. So the question basically is your new humanism is compatible with capitalism or ultra-liberalism, or should it be also a new economical and political system?
Hope that sounds a good question, and at the moment, my feeling is that no, it is not compatible with capitalism. I can't actually see a future for capitalism as it stands, but I'm not sure what the alternative is. I do think the world needs a fundamentally different economic model. Nobody has the power to impose it, so it's probably something that will just appear of its own accord, and I don't know what it's going to be. But and it has been said, hasn't it, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, and it's really difficult to see how we can break the logic of capitalism. The old humanism and capitalism did go hand in hand historically. We know that, I think that we need to have the courage and the imagination to think of new economic models in the sense of new. I said, meaning not revolutionary new, but actually learning from ways of doing things that have been around before in human history. I mean, that's just it's a concluding thing. I'm an anthropologist, and I think that's really where the power of anthropology lies, or should lie. I would say that every life lived is an experiment in living. And we can learn from those experiments. And we can only learn from them if we listen to what people have to say about them and take what they say seriously. We have an enormous pile, we have a huge store of experiments and results of these experiments that have accumulated over the entire world, over the entirety of history. And I think that we can really look into that store and see what we can find that might help us with some guides to the future. But I don't think that tweaking capitalism will help.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Merci encore Tim, et merci à toute la salle pour les questions, les commentaires. Je pense que c'est un peu l'esprit qui est initié par Tim de ce dialogue en fait, où des propositions font réagir et nous permettent d'approfondir notre réflexion collectivement. Donc je ne sais pas si c'est de l'intelligence collective, mais c'est probablement un pas vers la sagesse. Voilà, merci beaucoup.